Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. Today we've got on the podcast a longtime friend of the pod, friend of online, Mr. Christopher Hooks, who's a Texas roustabout journalist, writer,
Scallywag?
Man, yeah, editor at large for just the Texas people as a whole. You know,
man about town.
Yeah. So, you know, when you turn 50, they're going to give you your own F-150 and your own cowboy hat and your own belt buckle that's precisely the size of your head. And so preemptive congratulations for that, Chris, and thanks for coming on the pod.
F-150. I don't want to drive something that small. It's good to be here. I have a lot of words to add to my business card.
Yeah.
It's the least we could do.
Yeah, and anyways, to get us started here, so Chris, I would say fair to say you're a sort of like state political reporter for the most part in Texas politics, which is a incomprehensible shit show that, you know, inscrutable to outsiders. It's sort of like the Polish Parliament in the 1600s. But
I like that.
There has been an even maybe much bigger shit show in the Texas legislature over the last sort of couple of weeks to a month-ish, something like that. I've not been watching it super closely, to be perfectly honest, because it's very confusing. But why we wanted to have you on was to sort of explain this story, which is hilarious and interesting, but then maybe sort of we'll get into the implications of it later.
Sure.
And so if you could, maybe you could start out by laying out the players in this ridiculous story and then tell us what happened.
Okay. Well, Texas has been a one-party state since basically like 1998 or 2003. Republicans have won everything forever. There are much redder states that regularly elect Democrats than Texas, but the Texas Democratic Party has just been completely shut out of everything since at least 2003 and maybe before that. And that's for a lot of reasons, I think. But the main effect of it has been that the only political contests that matter come in the Republican primary between kind of two big tribes in the Republican Party, which have a lot of different players, but it's mainly like the really simple version of it is that it's basically like Chamber of Commerce Republicans who maybe don't really give a shit about gay people, but like want to make a lot of money and you know, are fine with the government helping them do that. And then a kind of what maybe we used to call like Tea Party Republicans, like pretty people that are pretty on the far right, like people who are super Christian and really want to do culture war and don't really give a shit about the people making money. In 2009, in 2008, the Obama wave year helped Democrats put a lot of people in the Texas State House. They didn't win outright, but they got pretty close. And they teamed up with some Republicans to elect a speaker that was part of the Chamber of Commerce crowd, this guy named Joe Strauss, who is from San Antonio. He's his family's into horse racing, I think. He's just he was like a more moderate Republican who gave Democrats a lot of committee chairmanships, and that turned out to be really consequential over the Obama years because some of the states that went really far right in the 2010 election, like Oklahoma and Kansas and some other places, just like absolutely shredded public services in a way that Texas was sort of able to avoid. And Joe Strauss helped kill some really right-wing social legislation. He didn't kill everything, and his house was pretty conservative. It just wasn't as conservative as it could have been. So some really peculiar rich guys, particularly this one oil man from Midland named Tim Dunn and a couple of his friends, funded to the tune of tens of millions of dollars a sprawling far-right campaign to get rid of Joe Strauss, who they hated for several reasons. The sort of the mostly unspoken one is that the guy was Jewish and they wanted a Christian guy to be speaker and do Christian things. Because the Democrats couldn't win anything, the only thing to watch was this fight between like Christian warriors and the kind of Chamber of Commerce Republicans. And it was an important one to watch because it ended up having pretty significant like policy implications in the Texas legislature. And at least for some of the time during Obama's presidency, it was unclear who was going to prevail. It was a really weird time in Texas politics, and the guys that were trying to replace Strauss brought up a lot of eccentrics and kind of unusual people, I guess, to put it mildly, to like run against moderate Republicans in the Texas House and try to knock them out. And sometimes they succeeded. This went on for years. Tim Dunn spent a significant part of his fortune to try to do this, and they ultimately were not able to get rid of Strauss. He resigned he announced his resignation in 2017, and he left soon after. He was replaced by his kind of second in command, a guy named Dennis Bonnen. He was this young veteran of the Texas House who was considered to be like a pretty smart guy and kind of like a killer. He was pretty aggressive. He was the smartest guy in a lot of the rooms that he was in, and he knew it. He liked to fight with reporters, and he had initially kind of the reputation of being kind of a bully, but he eventually overcame that. And when Strauss stepped down, he became speaker. The leader of this really kind of sprawling effort to get rid of Joe Strauss, the guy that Tim Dunn was essentially entrusting a lot of his money to, is this guy named Michael Quinn Sullivan. And he was eccentric in a lot of the same ways that the far-right people he was trying to promote were. A long time ago, he was a newspaper reporter, and then he worked in Ron Paul's district office. I believe about the same time that those really racist Ron Paul newsletters came out. I don't know exactly what the story is with that. But he kind of did a lot of nothing for many years in politics, and kind of popped out of nowhere as the kind of the field marshal in charge of this effort. He has this group called Empower Texans, which is kind of like an ad hoc media organization. They write stuff and try to get their message out there. They also endorse candidates, they fund candidates, and they're closely allied with a lot of other groups that happen to be on kind of the Texas far right, including groups as eclectic as the Texas Homeschool Coalition, which has a surprising amount of influence here for many years, and Texans for Vaccine Choice, and Women on the Wall, and these Tea Party groups. It was this big kind of messy coalition, and usually Michael Quinn Sullivan and Tim Dunn were somewhere a couple steps away from it all.
Chris, what is Texans for Vaccine Choice? What the hell does that mean?
People who oppose the terrible government mandates which threaten the integrity of our bodily fluids. I don't know.
Big government, at it again, forcing you to get the vaccine.
Yeah. They've gone away a little bit, I think, but there's still a substantial kind of vaccine skeptic community. And weirdly, they all seem to be on the right in the legislature, even though most of the people in real life who don't get vaccinated are somewhere on the political left.
Crunchy. We call them crunchy woo-woo.
Crunchy, yeah. So the main story in Texas politics for 10 years, almost 10 years, was this fight between these two big coalitions. And the Obama era came to an end, and Texas politics started to look more competitive. 2016 was not necessarily a good year for Texas Democrats, but it was a year that they made some surprising gains, and it seemed to indicate that Trump might present an opportunity to them, in that like a lot of new voters and like non-white voters and young voters that maybe did not come out in the past might come out because they hate Trump, and also that a lot of like respectable like white suburban voters who may vote for the Republicans mostly for like pocketbook issues, like hated Trump enough that maybe something interesting could happen.
Just sorry to interrupt here, but it's an interesting factoid that baffled me when I saw it on the night of the election was that Hillary Clinton did better in Texas than she did in Iowa, despite not campaigning in Texas like at all, really. She only, quote unquote, but she only lost by 9 points. I think she lost Iowa by 11 points, which Obama won, and so that speaks to exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
And it was really kind of a shocking night here. Like I went to an election night watch party in Houston in Harris County, the like local Republican Party, where a bunch of like big statewide Republican officials here, like Dan Patrick, who's like a super right wing guy, were going to be gathering together to watch the election results. And to my eternal shame, like I went thinking that it would be like a fun night to watch Trump lose, or like a fun place to do that. And I have ever since been convinced that I had something to do with Trump winning. But people there were happy, but they weren't that happy. Because the Republican Party in Houston got absolutely fucking wiped. In a way that they never had before. And Dan Patrick, this right-wing guy whose son was a local judge, lost his local judgeship as part of this enormous blue wave. And some of it was like Democrats turning out their like core voters in a way they hadn't before, and some of it was these like traditionally Republican kind of like lawyers and doctors and professionals and other kind of people in the suburbs just like turning away from the party. And if enough of them did that, and they did it consistently, Democrats could do something interesting, because they kind of like, they have to be building at both ends. They have to be getting the people on the left and the people in the middle. And they seem to do that. And then they did it again in 2018. I had been really like pessimistic about the near-term future of the Texas Democratic Party, and I like kind of remained so through basically the election in 2018. But it ended up being a lot better for Texas Democrats than I thought. And they won a lot of interesting elections. Maybe the main opportunity that presented itself was they won 12 seats in the Texas House to take 67 of the 75 that they need to have the majority. And if you went down the list and looked at every state house district that they won by, or that they lost by less than 5 points, if the Democrats were somehow able to flip all of those districts, they would have the majority in the state house. And it's hard to overstate what a enormous, like, psychic shock that would be to Texas politics, just in terms of convincing people that Texas politics is competitive, that like candidates should run, that political consultants should come home and join campaigns, that there's like exciting things to do here. And also because it's a redistricting year next year, the ownership of the Texas House would let Democrats have some influence in drawing congressional districts, hypothetically. There's a longer story to that. But this freaked out Texas Republicans a little bit. And they decided that what they absolutely needed to do is maintain the Texas House. And so Dennis Bonnen, this like the smartest guy in the room, reached out to Michael Quinn Sullivan, the leader of this far right faction, and brought him in, and apparently offered him a deal. And the deal was that if empowered Texans and Michael Quinn Sullivan would direct money to target 10 incumbent Republicans in the Texas House, the Speaker, Dennis Bonnen, would give Michael Quinn Sullivan's group press credentials to cover the next legislative session.
And to be clear, Empowered Texans, you mentioned, that's the sort of like dark money group that Tim Dunn runs, right?
Yeah, that he funds. Yeah. It's sort of like the mothership far right group in Texas.
Right. Okay.
And what they have wanted for a long time is press credentials to cover the legislative session. And the fear among people that don't want them to have that is that they'll use the press credentials to get on the floor of the Texas House and push their issues to lawmakers directly while they're taking votes. And so that's something that they've tried to get for a long time and has been bitterly opposed by a lot of Republicans in the House. So Bonnen came to them and offered this, apparently, allegedly, in exchange for Empower Texans agreeing not to go after anyone else in the Republican Party, but to target these 10 Republicans that Dennis Bonnen wanted to defeat for re-election in the Republican primary. And this was the idea that he would do this was kind of shocking because the House Speaker, Dennis Bonnen, had publicly indicated that he was not going to tolerate anyone in the House trying to unseat anyone else, that he was going to try to reelect all Republican incumbents, and that's what he was 100% focused on. As a fairly popular House Speaker, he was almost guaranteed to be made House Speaker again in the coming session.
Unless, Chris, is this right? Unless the Democrats took the House. And so it seems like he wants to target these 10 because he thinks their opponents would be better, would give him a better chance of ensuring that? Or what's the rationale there?
It's hard to tell. He has fought with some of these Texas House members in the past, but it's not at all clear to, I think, anyone right now what he would have gotten if he had unseated these guys. It seemed like the only way that he could lose his speakership is if the Democrats took the House. But the kind of second threat is if the Democrats join with dissident Republicans and elect a speaker in the same way that they did in 2009. And so it's not in Bonnen's interest at all to be alienating incumbent Republicans. If word of this deal got out, a lot of Republicans would be pissed at him for meeting with Michael Quinn Sullivan at all because they hate him. But also the idea that he had broken his word and was trying to take out incumbent Republicans with the help of this guy that a lot of people hate would have been tremendously politically damaging to him.
Well, it's a good thing that Michael Quinn Sullivan is very trustworthy and known to be, right?
Yeah, he is. He is probably. Yeah, he is not someone that you would want to take a meeting with. Period. Probably. He is not somebody that you would want to come to with a potentially illegal deal, or offer a bribe that, if revealed, could potentially be a felony of some kind. Michael Quinn Sullivan has been public about the fact that he hates. His groups really do not like Bonnen, who is kind of an inheritor of the moderate regime of Joe Strauss. So when a month after this meeting, he came out and alleged that Bonnen had offered them this deal. There were a lot of people who were curious about what the truth was, but it didn't seem to be something that was that plausible. It didn't seem like Michael Quinn Sullivan would lie about it because it was too big to lie about. Clearly they had met and something had happened, but it boggled a lot of people's imaginations that Bonnen would offer what was in fact a bribe, like a bribe for a payoff that, if revealed, would be hugely politically damaging to him. And so initially the Speaker and another Republican that was the Speaker sort of denied that this had happened. He released a couple of statements that were sort of denials, but very curiously worded. And he didn't seem to address the core accusation that Michael Quinn Sullivan had made.
They were Clinton-esque, if you will.
They were Clinton-esque. It was very... depending on what the meaning of the word is.
Yeah, exactly.
Dennis Bonnen related a lot of weird details about this meeting that had taken place, but did not address at all the idea that like a list had been that had been given to Sullivan, like a hit list had been given to Sullivan in the first statement that he made, and then in the second statement he made, he said it didn't come up in our conversation, which was curious because Sullivan had alleged that Bonnen had left the room before this list was read to him in the manner of like a mafia boss, I guess.
Or apparently how Trump does things that way as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he might not bring the stuff up in the room because he doesn't know what's going on.
Just dementia, maybe.
Yeah, so about a week later, Michael Quinn Sullivan revealed that he had taped the entire meeting, which was a real curveball, and not something like a development that was in a way surprising and in a way not surprising, because it seemed like the kind of thing Michael Quinn Sullivan would do. So all of a sudden, this Bonnen's potentially most dangerous enemy, I guess if you want to call it that, on in the Republican right, like announced that he basically had a tape of Bonnen and his allies maybe committing a felony. I don't think we know that for sure. The tape hasn't been made public yet, but Michael Quinn Sullivan started letting Republicans in the House and other Republican activists come and listen to this tape. And the word that emerged was that this tape was quite bad, and that in a way it was maybe worse than Sullivan had alleged. And
this is maybe my favorite part. My favorite part might be that he didn't just like release it to the press. He invited other Republicans to privately come listen to it. Like this is some curious shit.
Michael Quinn Sullivan is a messy bitch whom loves drama. I know what he's famous for, and he's going to milk this for everything it's worth. So he started letting people in Bonnen's own caucus come by and like listen to the tape by themselves one by one. The word was it was quite bad. Not only was the quid pro quo that he offered like quite clear apparently, but he also said some like really terrible things about other members of the House. He apparently said that one Democratic member of the House that his wife would be very disappointed to learn that he was gay, and he called another member vile and said some impolitic things about a number of Democrats and other Republicans. And this was damaging because he had kind of like done a very good job of presenting himself as a friendly face and a protector of all of the members of the House. It's just if you've been following the Texas legislature for a while, it's sort of hard to. It's enormously complicated, and it's hard to translate. But it's just the strangest thing that's happened here in a long time. Michael Quinn Sullivan is milking this. He might have released the tape eventually, or he might not. The possibility exists that the House Speaker, one of the most important Republican officials in Texas, committed a serious criminal offense. The Texas Rangers are investigating and are expected to produce a report at some time in the future. Bonnen is trying to hang on, in a way that's very curious to me, because if half of these things are true, it doesn't seem like he will be able to maintain his speakership and maybe not even his seat.
Well, that's what's weird, Chris. So he has not really denied anything, and yet he, from what you wrote, is one of the people calling for the release of the tape. Wouldn't that be bad for him?
Yes, there's a lot of parts of this that don't make sense. One of the theories going around about why Bonnen called for the release of the tape is that he felt like for some reason Sullivan would not release it, and that the call for the tape to be made public would in some way bolster Bonnen's case and make him look better.
12-dimensional chess, baby.
12-dimensional chess. There may be things on the tape that Sullivan does not want the public to hear, although
right.
If you went in with the intention of recording it, one would presume that that's not the case. It's just the damnedest thing. And the reason why it matters, is the Democrats do have a small chance of taking the Texas House, and the Republicans have put a tremendous amount of effort into trying to present this unified front to protect and defend the Texas House, and this is absolutely the last thing that they need right now. And I have no idea what the fuck is going to happen next.
Is there any kind of like indications of like failing morale? I mean, I know at the national level, 4 Texas Republicans have announced they're going to retire after the 2020 election, right? Anything like that happening at the state level?
Yeah, I mean, I think Republicans are seriously concerned. In a way, they might be more concerned than I am for their chances at this point. But there have been a number of senior Texas members of Congress that have retired and just said they don't want to fucking deal with it anymore, which gives the Democrats a couple of pickup opportunities. There's a couple of Texas Republicans at the state level that have retired or indicated and they have an interest in retiring. That free up a couple of state house seats that the Democrats might have a chance to take. I think that this fight that took place between the center and the right in the Texas Republican Party for years was possible because they had no external threats. And I think one way to look at what Bonnen was trying to do was a way to patch over that division in advance of an election that was potentially pretty consequential. And the guy on the far right told him to go fuck himself, basically. And that's not good for Texas Republican morale going forward. It's one of the more confounding things about this, I guess.
Well, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but my kind of read on the like center, quote unquote, moderate business Republican Texas, like GOP, was like one of their foundational tenets, like a keystone of their political economy. And this, I think, goes straight back through to the one party state when it was the Democrats back in the day, was bringing home that pork, getting those federal contracts, that the fucking Space Center in Houston, right? That was, that's jobs, that's business, that's money, that's profits. That is how you grease the wheels of a political machine. And I think one of the things that the far right has done is just say, no, we're just going to make this. We want poverty. We want impoverished citizens. We don't want successful businesses. We don't want any of this federal pork. And just the other day, right, they announced that some big NASA thing, I forget what it is. Maybe you can tell us about it. It went to Huntsville, Alabama, instead of the Johnson Center in Houston, right? And so, like, how is that kind of interacting with this? Like, just sort of pulling out one of the props of this whole kind of machine.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. I think one of the interesting things to watch here since Obama took office has been it's a very particular political climate if the general election doesn't matter and the Republican primary matters. And in the Republican primary, especially if you're running for a statewide seat, the way to win is just go super far right. And people did that with great success. That was what Ted Cruz did, and Dan Patrick and other statewide officials are indicted. Attorney General Kim Paxton.
Wait, is Dan Patrick the lieutenant governor?
Dan Patrick is the lieutenant governor, which in Texas is arguably more important than the governor. He has a lot of powers. So these far right guys, the equation was that if you go to the right, you win the Republican primary, and if you win the Republican primary, you win the general. But if the balance tips back and the general election starts to matter again, the formula for winning the Republican primary is different than the formula that it takes to win the general election. They have a lot of guys are in office now who gained office because they were Tea Party guys, they were tax cutters, they were super xenophobic, they were super Christian warriors, and that's not necessarily what you do as a Republican, even in a state like Texas, if you want to win the general election. And one way that manifested at the congressional level, as you say, is that for many years, like Democrats and Republicans too represented Texas, like their main goal was to bring pork home all the time. And that's a big reason why Texas is like a prosperous state now, is because the congressional delegation was bringing back money constantly for universities and research centers and the NASA programs and Army bases and whatnot. If you're Ted Cruz, that's not how you work. And if you're some of the newer members of the Texas congressional delegation, that's not how you work, because you're elected by Tea Party guys. There has been I would argue, kind of a humiliating failure by the Texas congressional delegation in recent years to bring home shit for Texas. The biggest part of this was like after Hurricane Harvey, the Texas congressional delegation had to really bow before the president and beg for a moderate amount of relief funding, and it came much too late. I think there's sort of been a tension for many years from the Chamber of Commerce crew who maybe don't love Ted Cruz so much, don't love what other Republicans are doing for the state in D.C., and you might be seeing some of that accumulate as well. What happened the other day with the space program was Huntsville got the responsibility to design Trump's lunar program, which of course is bullshit. I think people are pretty clear that Trump's lunar program is not going to the moon. But the fact that Alabama got it and not Texas, despite what was apparently some pretty active effort by the Texas congressional delegation, I think poses a question, which is that Texas has been the bedrock of the National Republican Party for a long time. And especially these days, it's hard to tell what the state is getting for it from Republican administration in Washington. And that's not only pork, but Trump's trade policies are arguably good for the Midwest, but not good for Texas and not good for a lot of the rich people that live in Texas. And a lot of the kind of other flagship policies of the Trump administration are not super popular here. And I think that's one of several things that are kind of lining up to present the impression that 2020 is maybe a year that some interesting things could happen in Texas.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this, it's like Texas is sort of like how California used to be for Republicans back in the day, in terms of money, sort of institutional organizing and so on. But I guess I feel like this is almost unimaginable for either party, but if it were to become the case that Texas were to become like purple or dare I say a reliably Democratic state, that would be sort of the end of the Republican Party as a national force. It would be virtually impossible to win. And so what is your sense, I guess, to start with, of is the state party and maybe the national party that you know of, are they really worried about this? Sort of groundswell of fresh Latino voters or something like that? What's the mood there?
Yeah, I mean, I I think they are seriously concerned, and like I say, like I tend towards pessimism on this as far as like Democratic ability in Texas goes, for just like having watched it for a long time. But then I talked to Republicans I know, and I'm kind of surprised by the subtext of like concern that there is. I think there's a lot of like caveats that you got to put on that. I think, like generally speaking, the kind of the dream of Democratic consultants on the national level for a long time has been like exactly as you say, that if you flip Texas, Republicans can't win the presidential election, and it's kind of like in the category of like a grand geostrategic sweep, like Nixon and Kissinger turning China or whatever, or like the Allies taking Italy out of the war in World War II. And it's kind of like hard for me to imagine that taking place, because a situation in which Democrats are able to win Texas is a situation in which they've already won like everything else. It's hard for me to imagine a situation in which like the Midwest goes, a significant portion of the Midwest goes Republican, but Texas goes Democrat, and so somebody is able to squeak into the White House that way.
Chris, did it surprise you that Franklin Bynum, who we've had on the pod a couple times and we love, the Honorable Franklin Bynum, won that election to be a big socialist judge for Harris County, 3 million Texans under his purview for very important issues? Under
his dictatorship.
Exactly. The dictatorship of the proletariat. Yeah, exactly.
Houston Soviet. I didn't follow that race that closely. It was surprising, of course, to see a socialist judge win in Texas. I guess it hasn't been so surprising to see the kind of pattern has deepened in recent years, where the Texas cities are pretty blue, and sort of the same thing is happening at a local level, where if you win the Democratic primary, or you win the you stand for the Democrats on the ballot, you're going to get elected. And that has created a set of really interesting political conditions here, which is that there's, the cities are pretty far to the left, and the cities are where most people live. And Texas has like 5 of the 20 largest cities in the country, I think. But the kind of baked in conditions of political competition at the state level are such that it's just almost impossible for Democrats to win any kind of serious influence. And so there's been a lot of conflict recently between the state government and local governments among things like, I know you talked about this with Franklin and Bryan, but the sick leave ordinances that have passed in a number of Texas cities recently. And the Republican state government has more and more taken to punching down at the left cities and trying to get them to undo their policies. And in some cases, it even sort of feels punitive. That's something that'll be very interesting to watch going forward.
Something, the thing about Texas that is maybe, surprising. I mean, I'm not an expert, but from how I've looked at it, you look at Texas as like Texas, it's not that white. It's like sort of in the same ballpark as California in terms of diversity. And yet it's been this conservative bulwark for many years. And one reason is that, the Latino population there, is fairly conservative, not as conservative as the white population, but like not a sort of monolithic Democratic bloc like African Americans. And yet, with this El Paso shooting, just to reiterate, this was a thing where a guy drove from Dallas, extremely white part of Texas, to go to El Paso, an extremely Latino part of Texas, just so he could massacre as many Latinos as he could. And with the explicit aim of saying, we're going to keep Texas Republican by violent terroristic intimidation of the Hispanic community. And like have you seen, any sort of ramifications from that? I've seen some reporting that it's just like this sort of shockwave, but how that's going to sort of like shake out politically, I suppose you just have to see. But any kind of like sort of tentative like realignment in progress, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, man, I can think of a lot of things to say about that. I think, yeah, I mean, one of the really depressing things is like a long-term observer of Texas politics is you can clip out portions of the El Paso shooters manifesto and match it up almost exactly with like stuff that statewide Republican leaders in Texas say on cable news, like, a week before the shooting. I've done a lot of thinking about why it is that the Democrats are have been so unable to get traction here in a way that they can't in a way that they do in like more Republican states. And I think part of it is that there's kind of a grand narrative that runs through Texas history and Texas political rhetoric about Texas being a place of the conflict of civilizations. Like in reality, Texas has always been a very diverse place, and it's more diverse today than it ever is. And it's at the crux of, back in the day, it was people came here because it was at the crux of like north, south, and east, west trade routes. And it's at the crossroads of like regions of the United States, and there's always been a lot of kind of diversity here, but a kind of grand narrative thread that runs through Texas politics is the idea that this is a place of white victory and a place that white civilization reclaimed from nature and Mexicans and that is obviously much less present and less overt than it used to be, but that is an idea that runs through most recent political campaigns that we've had in the rhetoric that's used by Texas Republicans, sometimes more overt than others. This is something that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has really relied on at points in his political career in a way that I think is deeply to his discredit. And you see that exact rhetoric in the El Paso Shooters Manifesto. And I wish I could say that the language of that manifesto and what had happened in El Paso was causing some kind of a crisis of conscience with Texas Republicans, even just the fear that they might pay some price for having used it. But that does not seem to be the case right now. The governor, Greg Abbott, recently appointed a task force to deal with domestic terrorism, and one of the members is Dan Patrick. So his role in that committee is presumably going to be like the Spider-Man v. Spider-Man meme, where he just sits on different sides of the room and points to himself and says, "This is a problem."
I have just a couple anecdotes because my interaction with Texas has been very interesting, and just to show how in some ways, and again, this might be a caricature, but this is my experience, there are kind of very embedded reactionary, just kind of ideologies pervading even those who should, who should think otherwise. One was on a plane with this guy and his fiance. We had a few drinks on the plane. He was a good old time. And then I'm like, oh, his politics are really reactionary. And then I learned that we were on our way to Texas. He had just gotten out of prison, out of a Texas prison. He'd just been released. And I'm thinking, man, those politics are really bad for you specifically. like your politics would put you in jail for a long time. I was just like perplexed because he was one of those people who had been kind of punished by the system in this terrible way and should have understood how bad that was. And then the other anecdote I have is I was driving around for research with this kind kind of small Texas town sheriff. And I was, coming from California. So he looked at me, and basically the first conversation we had was, so you're from California, huh? Well, over here, we believe that men are men and women are women. And I was like, all right, fair enough. So it was like this, whole new universe, and it was very interesting to me. But like, I think what we started with is important because as interesting and entrenched as some of these kind of very Texan characteristics might be, this shit show that you wrote about might provide some kind of, hope for the Republicans kind of blowing themselves up in a way that gives at least an opportunity, like crisis leads to opportunity for the Democrats. Is there something there that we can kind of latch onto at least?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's sort of been the Democratic hope here for like 15 years, is that the Texas Republicans have been so fucking crazy, and like they finally crossed the line, and there's going to be some blowback, and the blowback never comes. I think the main source of hope is just that like Trump is deeply unpopular here in a way that is
that's interesting.
Unusual. Like his approval numbers are really bad, and the last basically good election year the Democrats had relative to expectations was 2008, when George W. Bush was super unpopular, and Democrats won a lot of races they did not expect to win for that reason. I mean, I think in the longer term, I wonder when Trump is not here and he's not infuriating a certain number of independents and like suburban soccer moms, is the Democratic coalition here going to be able to do anything? And I don't know. I mean, I think the pattern here for a long time has sort of been like 2 steps forward, 1 3/4 steps back. And
right.
I think we're getting closer, and I think getting closer has positive consequences for like people in real material ways. But we will see. This is definitely not the start to the election season that Texas Republicans wanted, and that's been interesting to see.
What if? Because I always like to punch the liberals a little bit. And what if the Trumpian kind of divisiveness leads to an opening, and then socialists like Bernie Sanders and others actually provide material benefits to Texans that hadn't been provided, right, by the liberal oppositions? Is there hope there that actually like being given some real material change could form a new coalition?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been interesting. As the cities have gone bluer, the Republicans have made a clear attempt to try to pry nominal liberals away from the Democrats by drawing contrast between them and what they are saying the far lefties want to do. As these sick leave ordinances have happened, and as some other ordinances have been passed at the local level, one particularly recently in Austin, the city took off the books a set of criminal charges that police use against the homeless. The backlash to that locally has been kind of incredible, from
Nice.
Like center-left homeowners and other people furious at what the city council is doing. People who consider themselves Democrats but think that the city council has gone far to the left, and you see Republicans coming in to try to take advantage of that and use it as a wedge issue. So I don't know. There are a lot of opportunities for left activists in Texas cities to do interesting things. The sick leave ordinances was one of them. But the Democratic success here has sort of relied on being acceptable enough to people in the Texas political center, and that's like what Beto O'Rourke was really good at here. He was able to make some people on the left feel that he was with them, but he was also like speaking in grand enough and like vague enough rhetorical terms to make a lot of Republicans that voted for Greg Abbott vote for him. And so I think there's going to be kind of an interesting tension going forward between Democrats trying to retain some of those people in the suburbs that hate Trump, and while people on the left are doing activism for important reasons to try to pull the state to the left. And I couldn't really tell you how that's going to work out.
There's certainly a story you could tell, if you're trying to, create your own kind of counter mythology about Texas. That it's about, yes, white people, very important in the history, but there's also, El Paso, for instance, there have been, Latinos living there since like the 1500s.
Yeah.
They're that used to be part of Mexico, literally Tejas. That's where the word comes from.
Which is why my favorite hat is "Make America Mexico Again."
And and so much of this, the Western mythology in Texas and in Colorado and Arizona, the cowboy, that's the vaquero. We stole that from Spain, and Mexico and to sort of like put a new cast on those images and symbols. And Juneteenth also, Texas slave state, and that Juneteenth is huge. Is it not correct that one of the first Juneteenth celebrations happened in Texas someplace? I may be misremembering this.
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, but certainly very, the history of slavery and the history of abolition, very important in the state. So you could tell a story, the fact of the matter is Texas is one of the most diverse states in the country. And, you could tell a very Texas story that is, maybe even a little bit, triumphalist or whatever, and has a lot of hats and cattle and so forth in it. That is not that like the Dan Patrick white people are the only protagonists of history type of thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Alexei, this sort of goes back to what you were saying a second ago about that guy on the plane. I mean, I think among the many things that the Republican Party has had going for it here is just that they have this like grand narrative about Texas and Texas history, and who matters in it and what the major things are. And as you travel around the state, it's just like it's incredible to see how that history and that sense of history interacts with the like politics and the physical world. If you go down to San Jacinto, which is where the final battle of the Texas Revolution or the whatever it is took place, it's like today it's like a huge tank farm. It's one of the biggest petrochemical centers in the world, I think. And on these enormous oil tanks, as you go down, there are giant murals of scenes of the Battle of San Jacinto, in a way that's just like hard to imagine occurring in any other place in the world. And I think that if you could say that there's been kind of like a failure of the big of like the overarching Democratic coalition here, I think that one of them would be like a failure to put together a story of the state that is has a different focus and is inclusive of these people in some way, because Texans love stories, particularly stories about themselves. And I think there's definitely a way to do it. One of the most interesting places in Texas right now is a place called Fort Bend County, which is just outside Harris County, which is where most of Houston is. A couple of decades ago, it was just like undifferentiated, good old boy Texas Republican territory. They went Republican earlier than a lot of places in the state, and I think hadn't flipped Democratic in any election since LBJ in '64. But today, it's one of the most diverse places in the country, and like one of the star features of this county, which is the anchor of a congressional district and a couple of state house districts, is this enormous Hindu temple, which is built out of what I think is imported Italian marble. And it's home to a huge South Asian population, and I think like a West African population. Has incredible food, and it's one of the most interesting immigrant communities in the United States, I think. And the Pete Olson, the congressman who represented Fort Bend County for a long time, ran against a guy called Sri Kulkarni in the 2018 election. And among other things, Pete Olson called Sri Kulkarni an Indo-American carpetbagger. A genuinely bizarre set of words. And Pete Olson is retiring. He's getting the fuck out of there. And whatever that district is going to be an improvement, I think, on what it used to be. And I think like Texas is an interesting place for all its faults, and there's a way to build an identity for it that is not exclusionary. I don't know how long it will take to happen, but it will have to happen, I guess.
Gotta have hope, Chris. I feel like you need more hope than you have. I know you've been hurt time and time again, just like the Democrats have let all of us down time and time again. I get it. But come on, man, got to make it happen.
Yeah, the sad thing is, this is what feels like hope to me. which is probably something Chris sounds like. Yeah. Talk to my therapist about. But I feel more hopeful about politics here than I have for some time. I think as much dark shit is happening here still on a near daily basis. We'll see, I guess.
Cool. Well, I've got to take off actually, but Chris Hooks, thanks for coming on the show. We will link to your Texas Monthly article about this hilarious story in the description. Anything you want to plug else before we let you go?
No, I think that's about it. Thanks for having me, you guys. It's a pretty complicated story. I don't know how well I explained it, but I appreciate the chance to. All right, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on, man. Hope you come back.
Yeah, I would love to.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.